Welcome back to another episode, another season of the IFC's Individuation podcast. I'm Dr. Lahab Al-Samarrai, and with me today, the Wrecking Crew. They're all back and excited for a new year, I think. One of them is waving. So, without further ado, Dr. Eric Tomlinson is with us and his cat. I don't know the name of the cat. And Dr. Lisa Hong is with us also.
Happy New Year.
Lisa, how you doing?
I'm doing good. It's New Year. I am glad to be looking forward to 2023. Let's get started.
Dr. Eric, how you doing?
Doing okay, sir. It's a joy to see you and Lisa after a couple of weeks off.
Yeah.
And to have an hour and 15-minute discussion before we get going is always educational, at times exhilarating, at times spiritual, at times logical and practical, and at other times cosmic oriented.
You did sound right silly.
Well, that's just now I have to live up to that.
Wait a minute.
I try to live up to the cosmic
and I'm just
part.
being honest in telling you what I actually think.
It's my shadow.
Okay, but I mean that.
It comes from my shadow because my ego would say, of course, but my shadow goes, okay. No, don't say those things about it.
Damn it, I mean it, and it's. I've been charged. I've been low energy all day, and now I feel charged up from the hour and 15 minutes discussion that we had before you just clicked on. So put that in your pipe and smoke it, as we say down here in Florida.
Okay, so as we smoke on this today, what are we going to cover? Today we're going to talk about things that we're going to smoke. No, we're going to talk about the shadow. The shadow, what the shadow is, how the shadow. What is this complex called the shadow? Why is it there? What's the purpose of this complex? How does it function in the world? Because when we want to take you on a journey in a series that we would like to do with you, starting out in our 4th season. And the journey we'd like to take is to use Mindhunter, the series on Netflix for 2 seasons, to help you understand how the shadow, the ego, the persona, how these Jungian terms apply to understanding of their psychology, of the way they function, of why they function the way they do. So we want to get into a conversation about how the shadow and the persona are, the term is ego alien to the ego. So the shadow and the persona are ego alien to the ego. Okay, what does that mean? So it's kind of weird. So if you want to read more extensively about this, please pick up a copy of Dr. Murray Stein's
one of the best books. One of the best books I've ever read, Dr. Lahab.
It's quite brilliant, and we use a lot of Dr. Stein's understanding of analytical psychology to explain certain very complicated phenomena psychologically.
And if I may, Dr. Lahab, I've never had the chance to do this publicly, but now I have the opportunity. So strike while the iron is hot. Because of you, I was able to undergo 2 years of analysis under Dr. Murray Stein. That was because of you. He
Well,
had a waiting list that was about from Florida to California, and you got me in there, and he helped me understand my anima, probably more than I had at that point in time than anybody. And that's all because of you. And I know I've told you before, but never said it publicly. I'm extremely grateful that you connected me with him.
Well, we are grateful for Dr. Stein.
So thank you, Lahab, Dr. Lahab.
I appreciate it. Thank you, Dr. Eric. So I wanted to go into Jung's map of the soul, and I wanted to take out a part, or quote a part, actually. I'll just read it out from Dr. Stein's book. This is on page 108, and this is the quote that I'm going to read out. This is Dr. Stein. What ego consciousness rejects becomes shadow. What it is positively accepts and identifies with, absorbs into itself, becomes a part of itself and of the persona. The shadow is characterized by the traits and qualities that are incompatible with the consciousness of the ego and the persona. The shadow and the persona are both ego-alien persons that inhabit the psyche along with the conscious personality that we know ourselves to be. There is the official and public person that Jung called the persona. This is more or less identified with ego consciousness and forms the psychosocial identity of the individual. Yet it's also like the shadow, ego-alien, although the ego is more at ease with it because it's compatible with social norms and mores. The shadow personality is hidden away from sight and comes out only on special occasions. The world is more or less unaware of this person. The persona is much more evident. It plays an official role daily of adaptation to the social world. Having a beard, shaving, cutting your hair, changing your makeup, changing the way you dress, persona. Shadow and persona are like two brothers for a man or sisters for a woman. One is out in public and the other is hidden and away and reclusive. They are a study in contrast. Okay, so that's Dr. Stein. So I would like to also talk about how the shadow, the term shadow is not expansive enough to contain what is happening. I think a better term for shadow would be the unknown other. After all, it is ego alien. So the ego can't say, this is another part of me. This is my shadow. If it's ego alien, it's an unidentified other, the unknown other. As we talked about it in JAMP and the resolution of the glitch, talked about the unknown other, what Jung refers to and Dr. Stein referred to as the shadow. Okay. So what does not go into the ego, what the ego rejects, what would the ego reject? So if you're being raised by a Christian fundamentalist family, your ego would reject ideals of other religions. If you grew up in a conservative Islamic religious family, that would mean that you would not be open to other religions. Whatever the case may be, it depends on who and what and where the programming comes from. Is the programming helpful? Is the programming hurtful? And that's where the two aspects start to split. What the ego tolerates is what the ego believes it has to hold on to survive. What makes it whole. So if it has to be tenacious, it will become tenacious because that's a survival mechanism. But what happens to those aspects that you don't need to be tenacious over? Well, they would go into the unconscious, to the unknown other. The ego's awareness of this unknown other is only that it can operate when the ego refuses to. That's the deal. The other deal is that the ego doesn't know about it. Whatever you're going to do, don't tell me. Just do it. So now we have these three characters. So these three characters are a reflection of the self. All aspects of the psyche are reflections of the self. Ego consciousness is a reflection of the self's understanding. That ego that you start to develop is the ego that will help you survive in later life. It's also the ego you let go of as you become more integrated and individuated. Okay, so let's go back to
Dr. Lahab, really quickly, who are the three characters that you just referred to?
So the ego, the shadow or unknown other, and the persona.
Okay, thank you.
So for what Dr. Stein says is for the man, it would be his brothers, and for the woman, it would be her sisters. And if you're non-binary, then your brothers and sisters are non-binary. But they are who you are, but not exactly you. There is a form of separation between the three.
Which refers to the term the alien ego, the personalities being a reflection of the archetype, not that is has its function in required times to support the ego in survival. I'd say that's pretty.
Yes, and also independent of it. Mm-hmm. So if the self as the architect of the psyche, if these aspects of all psychic aspects are a mirror of the psyche, of the self, sorry, I was using that interchangeably. The complexes are a reflection of that which is greater, of the archetype of the self. The archetype of the self contains all these different complexes. And within these complexes, there is differentiation. Dr. Lisa, at the same time, the differentiation, there is a recognition and a disassociation between the three.
They talk about the recognition part.
The recognition is that I know you're here. Mm-hmm. So the ego recognizes the persona as a necessity. Right. I know you're here. We have to work together. But it won't recognize the unknown other or the shadow. It will say, I don't know about them. just in case they do something, so I don't get blamed for it. It's not really I don't know. I kind of know, but I don't want to talk about it. I want them to do their own. I don't want to know. And that's why the ego will say, "Oh, I was drunk. I was out of it. I don't know what you're talking about. I think you're mistaken. I think you were drunk." Maybe you were I don't know, because I don't remember this conversation ever happening. So denial, right? Or as the young kids say, it wasn't me. But I saw you. No, it wasn't me. Okay, so it wasn't you. So who was this, and how does this become an aspect of our everyday existence? Right? How does this work? So now what you're going out with into the world, Dr. Lisa, if you can imagine, you have to get ready for your world. So your persona sits in front of the mirror. That's your persona. This is okay. Do you have your game face on? That's your persona. Am I dressed for this? Persona. The ego says things like, am I ready? And then answers the question. Of course you're ready. The voice of doubt then comes from the shadow. You're not ready. The stronger, the louder the voice of the ego, the more consolidated the ego is, the less you hear the shadow, which is always dangerous, by the way.
Which aspect? To hear the shadow or not hear the shadow?
To be oblivious to the shadow. Very dangerous to be oblivious to the shadow. When you're a teenager, you start to see aspects of yourself that you hadn't seen before. They start to come out, right? Because you're less afraid of death. You're more willing to take risks in group. Teenagers actually are pretty conservative, except when it comes in a form of group, and it's a group activity and they have to show off. No, then they become wild and reckless. They become dangerous.
That's very true.
So if they're driving a car by themselves, research shows they're just as conservative as a 28, 35, or 37-year-old. But if they're driving a car with 3 other kids in the car, their age, then you have chaos. Then they're more likely to hit something or drive off of something. They're 70% more likely to do something stupid or have an accident. So recognition of shadow, actually, if there are young children who says, mommy said this is the bad me. This is how you recognize that there's already a differentiation. There's a good me and there's a bad me, and mommy said, and suddenly they become conscious of it. Right? The sooner you're conscious of the complex, that means the complex has been triggered by an emotional trauma.
I just thought of something. Can I give a connective point between what you're saying, which is wonderful, and I want you to continue on with that, of course, and the series that we were watching, which was about sociopathy. And I'd like to make a point about that if I could. So can I continue? Okay. Of course, in the early days, and I'm saying 1700s, everybody that showed those kinds of personality traits were called mad. They were mad, mad, mad. It's a mad, mad world. And then they were called crazy. And then they were called lunatics, because everybody thought that it had something to do with the moon, the lunar cycle. And so they called them lunatics. And they didn't understand that the reason there was so much crime and so many killings that took place during the lunar cycle is because there were no, unlike modern days, there were no street lights anywhere. People walked around with torches. It was dark everywhere. And so when the full moon was up, that was the greatest amount of light where people could walk and not walk into a tree, basically.
Ooh.
So that's when the most crimes were committed. But then the French, and one of the few things that the French, and I'm half French, other than winning the World Cup a year ago, they usually don't win at anything. But there was a French psychologist that came up with a brilliant, brilliant idea of sociopaths. He called it la folie de raisonner, which means the folly of reasoning. In English, it's called the reasoning madness. He saw that these people were mad, they were off kilter, but by gosh, they had a lot of reasoning power. Their mind had not gone astray. This was not schizophrenic. This was not many of the other medical diseases of the brain that we see where people lose cognitive powers. These people retain their cognitive powers and abilities, but use them in a horrific way. And I think in the series that we've just been watching with all of these sociopaths, we see a reasoning madness. They understand, their logic is a little bit different, but my gosh, there's a logic to it. I understand that logic.
The logic, the logic that is coherent to the understanding of why I did what I did.
Yes.
Even though it's not really comprehensible by a rational mind. So let's take your point. So if we go with that, then what we're staring at is that this is part of the ego. This is why the madness is rational. It's part of ego functioning.
Oh, well said.
So what resides in the shadow is the elements that contain the responsible empathic part of you. That has been disassociated and disconnected into the shadow. That has been disconnected and disassociated from because of emotional, physical, sexual,
psychological
abuse.
Yes, very well put together, Dr. Lahab.
And if those components are together in a certain way, that formula will create somebody who could become sociopathic. If the elements, if the temperature, if the violence, if the control, if the manipulation, if it's not haphazard.
Yeah, if it simmers long enough, especially through childhood and early development.
Systematic.
Yes.
What you're saying is it's systematic. It goes on for long periods of time.
Yes.
And it walks through and it does the things that it does to that.
Yes, thank you.
Murray Stein says here on page 108, what ego consciousness rejects becomes shadow. What it positively accepts and identifies with and absorbs into itself becomes a part of itself and of the persona. This absorption of the shadow is characterized by selfishness and is incompatible with the conscious ego and the persona. And it feeds itself and becomes a greater complex.
Yes.
Takes over.
Yes. So actually, the more the energy of the ego is based on control, power, selfishness, the ability not to care about the other. the more that ego becomes twisted in a way that it starts to create this sociopathic type of character.
Mm-hmm.
Because to be able to do these things that you believe, you would have to clear a way for yourself. And that means there are people standing in your way. What if you didn't like somebody standing in front of your car? The sociopath would take revenge, but we wouldn't call it revenge. We'd call it acceptable. That they had crossed somebody. Or it's a different form of control. It's a form of control of controlling the other by form of creating pain.
I think it looks to me also as another, going back to the survival. It requires this release in order for it to function and move on and not be possessed by something else that is driven by.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a very good point, Dr.
Yes.
Lisa.
It can't function without following through on this idea that they have.
Yes. Yeah. So it's self-perpetuating.
Mm-hmm.
I can relate to what she just said.
Yeah. So it's self-perpetuating. And if it's self-perpetuating, it draws on the same energy. It's not big enough to take in more energy. It's just big enough to keep pumping along this idea, this narrative, that what Dr. Eric referred to earlier as the rationale of the madman. There's a narrative, and it's the rationale of madness. But there's a narrative. There's a logic. It might not be your logic. It might not be the logic of those who agree on norms or socially appropriate etiquette, but for them, that's a logic.
Yeah, and Dr. Lahab, this reasoning madness, it makes sense to me because when I hear, and especially in the series that we just watched, when they interview these sociopaths, violent sociopaths, their madness has a lot of reasoning to it. Ooh. I mean, whether you agree with it or not, you can see the logical reasoning that they have behind it, especially when you understand the trauma and the abuse that they experienced.
Yes. So what you connected to is not that they're logical or that their reasoning is appropriate.
No, it's not appropriate.
I know. What we're connecting it to is that you could understand the series of events that led them to accept this as a logical way of explaining how this functions in the world.
Precisely. Thank you.
So,
but I don't agree with it. Just let everybody know.
I do.
I don't agree with it. It's not appropriate.
We understand. What I'm trying to delineate or clarify is that sometimes language is obscure and we want to be a little bit more precise about language. And what I mean appropriate, I mean, we do not condone this.
Absolutely.
What we're discussing is its evolution and how it's seen through this lens, because what we're going to talk about is the most extreme of that lens.
Yes. No, I'm glad you said all that. I'm just saying that I'm trying to understand them the way the way John Douglas did. I mean, I'm sorry, the way gosh, what's his name in the series?
Holden.
Who?
Holden.
Yeah, the way Holden did. He's trying to understand why they think and feel the way they do. And as a psychologist, I want to understand that. It has nothing to do with condoning it.
So no. I'm just clarifying language.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you are.
What we are discussing is the series. What we would like to discuss is the series called Mind Hunters. And we haven't gotten into it because what we wanted to do is give an overview of Jung's understanding of the psyche, because that's what we're going to use to explain what is going on. So for people to understand that we're using a certain modality, if you could tell by now, we are the IFC's Individuation podcast, so we do use a lot of Jung. So what Jung is talking about in psychological terms of how the evolution of what happens. How do you have a Hitler? How do you have a Stalin? How do you have a Saddam? How do you have a Kemper? How do you have a Jeffrey Dahmer?
Yeah.
A Putin? How do you get these characters? Where do they come from? How do they evolve? How do they function? How do they think? Why do they think the way they think? Why do they feel so superior to others? Because there is a superiority feeling of superiority. So it's a two-way thing that goes on. It's I am superior to you because I don't acknowledge any of your mores or socially appropriate behavior.
Wow, what a great point. Thank you. Thank you.
So for the serial killers and the sociopaths, that's what they say. So
yes.
I am way out of your league, because the things that I am willing to do and think of and participate in, Dr. Lisa, are things that would curl the hair on the back of your neck.
They think everyone else is stupid.
Mm.
They really do.
So
only compared to them.
Dr. Lisa, you had a thought?
My thought goes to, we are all on a spectrum of all of these qualities, and the examples that we give are on an extreme.
Oh, yes, of course.
Yes.
We all contain, and I love your terminology of the unknown other.
Mm.
And without understanding the unknown other, we also need to understand the ego and the persona. And so I'd love to talk more about all three aspects. Yeah.
So the persona is the front of the office.
Yeah.
Right. There's a back of the office. We don't know what those people do. They're kind of secretive. They run their own circles. They have their own agendas.
Their own inspirations.
The middle of the office is kind of in charge. You know, they kind of run the place. But they don't listen. They maintain a wall between them, a glass wall between them and the back of the office.
Yeah, they're the managers.
So just in case something happens, they could deny that they were involved. So what happens? For example, you go out with a friend and you've been attracted to them for a long time and you've kept your mouth shut, and suddenly you've had a couple of drinks and all of it blurts out. You wake up in the morning and you're like, oh my God, what did you do? Okay, so now you have a cleanup crew, right? So who's the cleanup crew? Well, first you have to get yourself situated. So your persona has to say, well, you need to look good so you don't look crazy. Blame it on the crazy other. Blame it on feelings because you were lonely.
Let's say you're a warrior archetype and you get into hot water.
Yes.
You know that a discussion is going to come up. So as a warrior, you're going to go in saying, I need to look calm, collected, in control.
Yeah.
I need to look like I am stalwart and unflappable.
Yes. And I need a weapon just in case to scare the conversation in a different way. Just in case all else fails, I'll pick up my weapon and put it on the table.
I'm going to recall these are the things that I could say or prove.
Yeah.
And I am prepared.
And if I don't have a weapon, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say failure to abide by any weapons that I had. It's because I'm emotionally drained and I took it towards you.
So the persona is that prepared, contained person that you want to present.
Yes, the more alien the persona is to the ego, it's almost like you have people functioning in different ways and they don't know they're functioning that way. So you'll have somebody who will go out in the world, they'll put on their makeup, they'll put on their mask, they'll put on their suit, they'll put on whatever and go out in the world. And they will act like this thing, this entity. And then that entity comes home, it takes off its clothes and kind of changes, and suddenly that persona is gone. And now something else takes over.
Well, Dr. Lisa brought up a good point, but let me add this real quickly. It's something that I've been involved in for a long time, and that is the pure. I'm talking about the purest warrior, the one who follows the Bushido, the one who follows the way of the warrior, and who is alone. They're called Ronin. Ronin. They don't have a master that they're serving. They're wandering, trying to wonder where to serve. They have an attitude that recognizes, and this is what I appreciate about the Ronin more than any other warrior, is that they understand that they need to analyze their own behaviors in order to understand whether it was pure to the Bushido, the way of the warrior. And they're able to reflect and then change, literally change some of their ways because of some of their actions in the past. So they're not stuck on a conveyor belt the way a lot of people think they are. They're not. That's the pure warrior. So I wanted to distinguish the pure warrior from the regular warrior, if I may. Thank you very much.
We're thinking of purity in terms of... Go ahead, Dr. Lisa.
I was going to say, before we move on to your point,
yeah,
it could also be commonly called as an integrated warrior.
Mm.
So
very good.
This of what you just described as an integrated individual.
Thank you, Lisa. And why am I surprised that you came up with that term? I mean, come on. You're Lisa. You're Dr. Lisa. Come on.
So if you think about how the warrior is represented in Ronin, what you're looking at is more of the devotion to the archetype, what Dr. Eric is calling the pure warrior. That's more of a devotion to the archetype. It's more of the archetype as a religion.
The way of the warrior.
The way of the warrior. Than it is as we're talking about the archetypal, the archetype that is out there that is not the Ronin, because the Ronin is one extreme of the warrior archetype. The other extreme of the warrior archetype is the assassin, right? They're not Ronin.
Yeah, that's true.
They're on the other side, and they're rent to hire. They will take...
They're sociopaths, Dr. Lahab.
That's correct, Dr. Eric. But this is where we find those on the other end. These are the ones how they vacillate between one extreme and the other extreme, right? So the recent killings in Idaho at the university, by this kid, I think he's a sociopath. I think he's a serial killer. I think that he got caught. he actually had sent out a survey to ask questions about how to get away with things, how would one get away with something. He had a survey on SurveyMonkey about how to get away.
So glad he was caught. I'm so glad.
No, he was definitely a serial killer in the making.
Oh, this just thirsted him.
Oh, yeah.
So glad he was caught.
Yeah, because it's so dangerous that they get away with one. And they go on these streaks of killing.
Yeah.
Until they're stopped.
And as the other serial killers would say that we saw, not only in books and other literature, but in the series that we saw, he got a taste for it. That's the thing they always say. All of them. He got a taste for it.
Yeah. There is something, and this is where, when we talk about evil and where evil reside, evil does not reside in the shadow. Evil resides in the ego.
Oh, thank you for saying that. That's powerful.
The ego is where evil resides, because the ego is the part of you that decides to do something that is evil. Evil requires consciousness.
That's really good, Dr. Lahab.
Right?
I'm glad this is recorded because I want to watch this again.
This is about how the evolution of a child, a human child, into what people would call later as monsters, right? Because they're unreal, because of the damage they created, the killings the amount of pain they inflicted on so many people.
That's interesting,
right?
That's interesting because one of the partners in the series that we've been watching, Mindhunter, he wrote a book in real life called Monsters Among Us.
Ooh, interesting.
Yeah. Very good book.
Yeah. So, what we're planning to do in this series is we're going to talk about the characters. We're going to talk about the different serial killers that they catch and interview. We're going to talk about the conversations they're having and how it's affecting them. More importantly, how it's affecting them psychologically, emotionally, spiritually, their intimate life. How is it affecting them? How is it taking a toll on them being human, right? Because there's an aspect to the serial killer that's non-human, right? Because they feel that people are alien to them. They need to dissect them. They need to look inside of them to know how they function. They don't see themselves. They lack that empathy. They don't see themselves in the other. So we're going to talk about all these different aspects of, we've been talking about fairy tales and evil in fairy tales, of what constitutes evil in fairy tales. And if you look at fairy tales, people who are doing evil are very conscious of it. They don't say, oh, no, that wasn't me, or I wasn't thinking. No, they say, yeah, this is exactly what I wanted to do. You know, just look at Escobar. This is exactly what I wanted to do. With that, we're going to get into more of these ideas and stories around how these, maybe if we don't answer the underlying questions of how they are created, maybe what we can do is fill in some holes, maybe some ideas about what can happen, what can go wrong. maybe how to become more aware of what's happening. If you see if you are part of something, if you have pain, because what ultimately contributes to this is trauma and disassociation, right? Treatment is required before things get out of hand. So we will be back next week with another episode of the IFC's Individuation podcast, as we always sign off at the IFC. I am not afraid.
I am not afraid.
We are not afraid, and we are the IFC, and we'll be back next week. Take care, everyone.